Welcome, everyone, to the webinar on changing the culture at Boeing. I think everyone on this webinar knows the current situation and status at Boeing. There's been lots of commentary and webinars on the problems at Boeing, but what Sam and I wanted to focus on in this webinar is how can you actually change the culture at Boeing? And we picked Boeing not to pick on them, but because the problems they have been long-term, systemic, and are in the public arena, so that we were able to get information on what the problems are and try to put together a process by which they can begin to fix their culture. So, with that, what are some of the roots? And Sam, I'm going to pitch it over to you.
Thanks, Tom. And it's great to be here with everyone and really have the opportunity to take a deep dive and look at where some things may have gone wrong for Boeing and how they could have prevented that. But even more importantly, what do they do now? And I just want to reiterate, Tom, yeah, we're not picking on Boeing by any stretch of the imagination, but they're in the news and there's some real issues out there. And so they provide us a learning opportunity. And I think it's critical that we take that learning opportunity. The challenge with Boeing is if you go back to 1997 when they merged with McDonnell Douglas, and you had two cultures that came together at this point. And whenever you're involved with mergers and acquisitions, it's so often we look at the numbers and we look at how it's going to impact market share, and we look at profitability, and we look at where we're going to be able to trim costs and create savings because of the merger and acquisition. But the reality is the most important thing that we can do during the process of merger and acquisition is to evaluate the culture, because we need to know how these two cultures are going to come together. And we need to know where there could be a possibly failure. We need to know how to onboard the new organization to make sure that we are protecting the culture. So this is all important to take into consideration. And what happened at this point, as far as back in 97, is you had a very high engineering, quality oriented culture at Boeing. And you have a very um, bottom line, Wall Street focused culture at McDonnell Douglas. And this is what has really led to the problems that flowed out of that. At the time of the culture of the merger of the two organizations, and some of these quotes I'm pulling from the Netflix documentary Downfall. If you haven't seen that movie, it's a great movie to watch. Quotes at the time: "If it ain't Boeing, I ain't going." Popular saying among pilots. It was in common use in the decades before the 737 MAX scandal happened. Initially, no one thought it was the airplane. They're referring to the 737 MAX situation. I really loved working there because I had a say, and when something wasn't right, I could bring it up and I wasn't afraid of being fired. Senior management knew that safety came first. And if we said, hey, it's not safe, it's not ready to fly, then we're not going. The culture back then was we're all in this together and Boeing's going to look out for you and we expect you to look out for Boeing. And the last quote, which I think has set the tone, and we see this today with the whistleblowers situation. Imagine coming into work and you've got a whole new set of bosses and everything you've learned for 30 years is now wrong. And this was a Boeing employee describing the period after the 97 merger between Boeing and McDonnell Douglas. And so what's happened is we have these cultures that have come together, and rather than taking the characteristics of that are going to best serve someone in the aeronautics industry, meaning producing high quality airplanes, they took on the characteristics of a culture of don't ask, don't tell. We're going to maximize the bottom line. We'll fix it once it's up in the air. And along with that, the way that the employees were treated, that started to come down. So what we know to be true about workplace culture is the customer experience can never be better than the employee experience. If you want your customers, and those it could be Delta Airlines, it could be people like you and me, they're going to fly on those airplanes. It could be the FAA, everyone in the marketplace. If you want them to have a great experience, then your people need to have a great experience. And so these were problems that were put in place with the merger. And once that merger happened, then all new product and development, all manufacturing was now operating under a new way of thinking. And that new way of thinking has produced a new set of results that now Boeing is having to live with. Tom?
Sure, leadership has a role in this, and Sam articulated certainly a failure of vision. I wanted to talk about the cultural failures that Sam hinted at for all stakeholders. It's not simply the planes, it's not simply the flying public, it's not simply the regulators in the form of the SAA, but think about the purchasers of Boeing products, other stakeholders, the foreign leaders and foreign countries that Boeing flies to, all of those stakeholders have felt these failures, and airlines now are having to perhaps reassess their profitability based upon whether they can fly Boeing planes, to the point where the current Boeing CEO is having to personally meet with the presidents of all of the major airlines to try to satisfy them as well. We saw these failures play out in 2024 with the Alaskan airline, door that blew off, several other failures. We've had recently whistleblowers, unfortunately, one deceased for what appears to be suicide, but other whistleblowers have come forward. But it all starts with leadership. And Sam, the question I wanted to pose to you is, if you truly want to change a culture, what's the role of leadership and why does it all start with leadership?
Action follows belief. And so it's real easy to say, we need to do this, we should do this, we should do that. But the reality is, if leadership doesn't truly believe that a culture of quality, that a culture of compliance, that a culture where we do things right, that a culture where people feel safe to speak up, to share when things aren't going right. If leadership doesn't truly believe that, it's not going to happen. And so I believe that this discussion literally goes to the board of directors and the CEO. And this is where it must start. And what we've seen is a lot of organizations confuse the role of CEO and COO. And so a chief operating officer is tasked with making sure that they get things done. But what they get done needs to be in accordance with the strategic plan and with the culture that has been laid out by the board and specifically the CEO. The CEO's number one priority needs to be to protect and defend the culture. The COO's priority is to make things happen in accordance with the strategic plan. So if your culture is part of the strategic plan and the CEO believes that this is important, which means that her or his actions will align with that, then the CEO must operate under that way of thinking. If that is in place, if that's the type of leadership that's in place, then you can create this high performance, sustainable workplace culture that prioritizes compliance, ethics, quality, safety, valuing people, all the things that's important to have in a culture that attracts and retains the best people.
So, what we want to really communicate and talk to you about in this webinar is, how do you turn it around? And I see culture as another form of risk. And as any form of risk, it can be assessed. And Sam and I believe that the culture audit can provide that assessment. With that, Sam, I'm going to pitch it over to you to start a discussion on the culture audit.
Yeah, I want to do that. But first, Tom, if I may, I'd really like to go back to people that are in the room and ask you, have you experienced a situation either with a merger and acquisition or where you've moved from one organization to another, where you saw that the culture was going to cause a problem? And if so, if you have an example and can share that in the chat, would love to hear that, where you've seen two cultures potentially come together where they didn't mesh and what happened. Sharon, you raised your hand. I tell you what, if you want to unmute, I'd love to hear what you have to say.
Yeah, actually, I did because the chat's showing it's disabled right in the chat.
Okay.
But also, I actually was a facilitator at the Boeing Leadership Center for about 14 years. And I watched all of this play out that you're talking about. And certainly I watched that culture go downhill. I watched the change as they went from just throughout the years. We could share a lot. I could share a lot with you guys about my experience there at Boeing at the Boeing Leadership Center. I was a contract facilitator there, but certainly there were times when we were making efforts, we were making headways after the merger, and things were moving in the right direction. They had an ethics advisor that would come in and speak with the leadership programs and everything. But then over time, as the CEOs changed and as the culture changed, more and more we saw that procurement took over, supplier management took over, quality was less of a concern, leadership, et cetera, went downhill. So it was a really shame to watch it all happening.
Wow. Thanks for sharing that. That's really great. Let's see other hands that are raised. I've got James. I see James Knickerbocker. What do you have to share?
Hello, Sam. I was heavily involved in the merger of Hewlett Packard and Compaq Computer years ago, which at the time was the largest merger in high tech history. Is very controversial, if you recall. And my particular focus was cultural integration. So we did culture audits of both sides. We did interviews globally, in person and video, and compiled a lot of data. And we were part of the input to the decision, the go, no go decision in due diligence. And our vote actually, I mean, we were just one vote of many different departments, but our vote from a culture point of view was a no go because we saw huge differences in the culture. P was an opportunity based culture, Compaq was a fear based culture. So the way that you motivated people, the way leaders led was very different in those two cultures. And that was just one of
Wow.
dozens of differences that we found that led us to do a thumbs down. Now, of course, they went through with it anyway. We were only one vote. And then the job became, okay, we're doing it. Now, how do you help these teams to work together? And we had to do a lot of work to get them to understand each other. One of the problems was they both used the same words, but the words meant different things. They would both say customer focus, but what that looked
Mm-hmm.
like behaviorally was very different. They both said collaboration was important, but what that looked like in behavior was very different. And so the teams, when they were merging, would get into these fights over words like collaboration, customer focus, claiming the other one was not living up to that label, when in fact, from their point of view, they were. So it was a very interesting experience.
Wow. James, thanks for sharing that. It's really powerful. And you brought something up that's really important. A culture is defined by the values. And you could have a word that talks about customer centric, but to you, that might mean we get it done today. To me, that might be done. If we get it done by the end of the week, that's good enough. And so defining in specifics what that culture is going to be critical. Okay, one more response and then we'll move on. And that's David, you've waited patiently. I'd love to hear what you have to share.
Yeah, I wasn't waiting patiently, Sam, but thank you. No, the two credit unions are coming together in a merger. And for many years, they talked about how different the cultures were. Now, all the messages coming out are our cultures are so alike. It's going to be a really good mix. And it just feels like it's totally meant to justify and get, in particular, employees on side with the merger. After for a long time, the merger or the employees said, no, we're not at all alike. And it just kind of feels yucky.
All right, great. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, it's interesting. Tom, we see organizations that seem to step through some things, but they're doing it because it's politically correct, not because they're sincerely interested in what the feedback is from the people. And that's a cultural issue in and among itself. All right, let's move forward a little bit because here's what Tom and I want to share, and that is the culture audit, which is a way to fully understand what's going on in your culture. It's also a way to fully understand what's going on in the culture of an organization that maybe you're bringing on in a merger and acquisition so you can see where they align, where they don't align, where the strengths are, where the weaknesses are. And when you have that real data, then you're able to make real decisions on what needs to be protected and what needs to be shored up. Because if you know where your weaknesses are, you can work on them. But if you think you know where your weaknesses are, you could be totally wrong. So the first thing we want to do, and we show here some of the questions that we ask, we want to know specifically what's going on in the organization. And it's critical that this assessment is not just taken by top leadership because they can be tainted, but a diagonal slice of the organization. So everyone in the organization from top to bottom, or a representation, has the opportunity to participate, to answer these questions, and to provide real data. Once you have a significant level of participation and you have that real data, then it's important to look at the analysis of the data. Tom, if you'll swing to the next slide for us, please. So what we want to look at is we want to measure how is the culture performing. And specifically, we measure that what we call the culture index. So that's an overall score of how the culture is performing. In addition to that, we measure 15 areas. We actually measure accountability in what we call the accountability index. And then we go on to measure whether or not people are living the organizational beliefs and values. And that goes back to what you shared about the difference in understanding of what customer centric meant. This needs to be defined specifically in the values, and it's important to measure whether those values are understood and being lived. We look at what people focus on. We measure the clarity of the mission. We measure whether people are valued in an organization. We measure whether or not quality decisions are made, because if you consistently make quality decisions, you'll get a consistent quality result. If you're not making quality decisions, then the results are going to be iffy. We measure employee engagement, speed of making decisions, trust within the organization, level and quality of communication, whether innovation and change exists, safety. And we're not talking about physical safety, but emotional safety. Think about Boeing. People are afraid to speak up. Now, you do have some whistleblowers, but can you imagine how many other people have something that they could share and should share, but they're not because they don't feel safe. They don't feel that they're heard. They feel that they may be retaliated against. Ethics is critical to measure the culture of ethics in the organization. And the last thing we measure is stress, because quite frankly, some organizations in some industries, there's a certain amount of natural stress, but the question becomes how much stress is generated through the way that the organization operates, and what do we do to mediate that stress? So those are all the key areas that we believe that you need data on if you're going to look at your culture to perfect the culture, to create a high performance, sustainable culture that you would actually want. So Tom, if we could slip to the next slide, please. Oh, you do that so well. Thank you. And then the question is, what's next? We have the data, we measure, and now what? And this is where the culture audit really comes in and is really important, is you need an action plan. You need to know exactly what to do and how to go about doing it. Because if we have the real data on an organization, but then we're not taking the steps to do something with it, then we're wasting that information. So leadership that is operating as what we would call the accountable leader, they're not just going to let the data sit there. They're not just going to ask people their opinion and then ignore it, as one of the examples that was shared. They're going to take the data and then they're going to use that data to make decisions and look for ways to improve what's going on. And that's what it's all about, getting the data and then implementing based on a strategic plan so we can see that improvement. Tom?
So the insights that you get from the culture audit allow you to start a comeback. And what we wanted to maybe explore, because this is what we think is the most important lesson for every compliance officer, every ethics officer, every risk management officer, every CEO, every board, is what do you do when you found out about it? Boeing's found out about it. And we have all seen the news reports in 2024, and the need for Boeing is to rebuild literally from the ground up. How do you begin to make this comeback? And that's the actionable insights that Sam talked about. What do you do with that information, and how do you use that information to start to rebuild your culture literally from the ground up? And in a that's what we think the culture audit brings, is actionable insights This is not going to be an easy job, although Sam and I both think it's simple. It's assess where you are and then put together a strategy based on the information that you get from that assessment. Sam, I'm going to ask you to talk about some of the forward steps you see literally at this point.
When you look at an organization like Boeing that is in the world's eye and everyone's aware of it, they've created a hole that is going to be very difficult to dig out of. Now, I'm not saying they can't do it, but this isn't a one day to the next. This isn't this month. It's not even this year. They need a long period. They need a sustained period of time of outstanding performance. And so the steps to move forward is that starts with a commitment, the belief that this is important. And like I mentioned before, actions follow beliefs. Once the belief is in place, then we start to see actions that are aligned. They need to stop looking at the bottom line. They need to stop looking at Wall Street. Yes, they need to make money. They need to be profitable, but what they're doing is not helping their cause. And so once that's in place, then if you really believe that this is important, you start at the top with a team of individuals that are in charge of spearheading this movement. And they go, quality comes before everything. And if you put that stake in the ground, then you have to back that up, which means that everyone on the production line has the ability to say, there's a problem here. We need to stop and fix it. And while a number cruncher, and hey, my undergraduate degree is in accounting, so I can relate to the number crunchers out there. A number cruncher might say that's costing us money. That might cost us money today, but what's it going to save us over the long run? If you're willing to put that stake in the ground and you're willing to change your culture, then you start by measuring your culture and then you create an implementation plan that is specific with regards to what you're trying to achieve. And then you implement that plan and everything comes behind that plan, Tom.
Sam, there's 2 points I wanted to bring up. One is the culture audit being a software-based tool and solution. You and I have both done audits, assessments of culture in companies through town halls, through small groups, through perhaps some individual meetings. But literally, when you have thousands of employees across at least the breadth and scope of the United States, I think that a software tool can be a better choice. And if you're an international organization with employees literally across the world, I think it's important to note that the culture audit allows you to assess every employee that you want to. And Boeing could use a tool like this, or really any multinational or any multi-thousand employee company could use this tool at scale to get as much information as you could to literally start to build from the ground up. And the second point is, oh, go ahead. The second point is that, and I have to credit my friends at Infertal for this insight, that Boeing is one of two major aircraft manufacturers in the world. What they need is not profitability, number one, but market share, number one. And when you think about market share, that means who are your customers? They are worldwide airlines who are purchasing this. This could damage Boeing literally for years, because if an airline can't trust the product that they're getting, then the airline may have to go to another manufacturer. And so that is an important reason why I think this is so important. And with that, I'm going to pitch it back over to you, Sam, for the next slide.
Yeah, Tom, investing in your workplace culture may be the best investment a leader can make. Probably will yield the greatest bottom line results. What you mentioned before about Boeing and Airbus is really important. If you're not going to buy Boeing, you're going to buy Airbus. And so if you go back to the early days in IT, for instance, in computers, nobody ever got fired for buying an IBM computer. No one ever got fired for buying an IBM computer because it was an outstanding product. It was an outstanding organization. If you tried an off brand and it failed, you could lose your job in IT. If you bought an IBM computer and there was a problem, then the problem got fixed and you move forward. And now what's happened is because of the failures in culture, Boeing's in the situation where if it's my job to make the decision or lead a team that's making a decision in what's the next major aircraft acquisition, my job could be in jeopardy if I go with Boeing and it fails. Whereas if I go with Airbus at this point and there's a problem, you know what? I'm probably still safe because what's happened over the last decade is Airbus has shown that their products are living up to that good, strong reputation. That's important to take into consideration. What we're talking about here is really keeping our eye on the ball. And the eye on the ball is not units of production per day, but it's what's the ethics situation in the organization? Where's the level of trust among the coworkers in the organization? Do people feel safe in the organization? Can they speak up? Can they share? Is there an undue amount of stress that they're feeling? Are we working to mitigate that stress and create an environment where they can focus on getting the job done to a level of excellence? And are we being accountable? Are we living an accountable life within this organization? And when we measure those things like the culture audit does, then it gives us the opportunity to either reinforce what we're doing well or to step back and say, let's take some steps and let's fix the problem.
Because of the public nature of this Boeing scandal, we have a lot of information on the failures of Boeing. And so I wanted to maybe ask you to take a deeper dive into these key insights and ask, how would you begin to rebuild any of the five that you see on the key insight slides or even some others? But I'm going to start with trust. I'm going to assume there's a lack of trust because of what you've talked about already with the whistleblowers who did come forward and those who didn't come forward. How could a company begin to rebuild trust with their employee base?
You know, there's a leader that says, I, many times says, you have to earn my trust. And when the leader says that, I believe that leader doesn't really get it. The leader's the one that has to earn the trust, not the people. And so you earn trust by growing up. My father must have told me 50,172 times, actions speak louder than words. And I'm sure most of the people on this call probably heard that from their parents at some point. I know one of our certified accountability advisors in training, Luis Lar, is on the call. And Luis, I'm sure even in Mexico, you've heard that. Actions speak louder than words, right? And so this is what it comes down to. A leader earns trust through their actions. When the leader has your back, when you know the leader has your back, when you know the leader values you, when you know that the leader's making the best decisions for everyone involved, first and foremost, before the bottom line. When those types of things are happening in an organization, then what happens is you create an environment where people begin to trust that leader. And when they start to trust that leader, they will surround that leader. They'll shield the leader. They'll protect the leader. But until the people feel that the leader's willing to go to battle for them, to fight for their rights, to fight for their reputation, to fight for their emotional and physical safety, until the leader's willing to engage at that level, they're not going to earn that trust. And so the leader needs to step up and stand up for those things. And when they do that, then they will begin to earn the trust of their people. And it starts slow, but it will build speed.
How about accountability, Sam?
Wow, don't get me started. It's accountability is keeping your commitments to people. There's tactical commitments and relational commitments. The tactical commitments go to responsibility. We're responsible for things. We're responsible to get our job done. But accountability is all about the relational. And there are 10, we won't go into them now, relational commitments that define what accountability is, like a commitment to live the values, a commitment to stand by you when all hell breaks loose, a commitment to it's all of us, which means if you fail, I fail, and only if you succeed do I succeed. A commitment to the truth, a commitment to a good name. And when you listen to these and when you hear these commitments, you can see where Boeing has failed because leadership has not taken on these commitments. That's what defines accountability in the leadership. That's what defines accountability in all the people of the organization.
You mentioned stress earlier at the start of this webinar, Sam. Where do you see stress as a part of Boeing starting its comeback?
Tom, that's a great question because stress, a lot of jobs just naturally have stress. I mean, if building an airplane, there's going to be a certain amount of stress because every time you put a rivet into that airplane, every time you attach something that many people's lives are dependent upon that. When there's a certain amount of natural stress that's built into it, what are you doing as a leader to mediate that? What are you doing to reduce that? Or are you coming around as a leader and adding to the stress by the words and the actions that you're putting into play? And so when leadership understands that, then leadership needs to take steps to eliminate stress by supporting their people, by allowing them to speak up, by creating an environment where the people have a voice and they're heard. And when leadership creates that sort of environment, then what happens is when leadership gets out of the way and lets the people do their job, and people are rewarded for doing their job, and their job is not to bolt on that piece of equipment. Their job is to make sure that each and every airplane that comes off that line is excellent and that people's lives are safe when you fly on our equipment, that our lives are safe when you buy our food, that people's lives are safe when you use our products and services. When leadership allows their people to do, that's going to reduce the stress because what happens is the people feel that they have the ability to solve the problem. And that is a stress reducer amongst itself.
You also mentioned safety a little bit earlier in the webinar, and you further refined that as emotional safety. How is that a key insight, and what does Boeing or how can they begin to provide that to their employee base?
Tom, if you really believe something, then action follows belief and it's going to show up. And if you go to your people and you say, look, we've had a problem. This is transparency and honesty. This is not accountability. This is transparency and honesty. We've had a problem and it stops now. It stops now. We need to know what you're seeing. We need to know what you're thinking. We're going to create forms for you to speak up. If you want to speak up in an anonymous situation because you felt that there's been retaliation in the past, I guarantee you there's going to be no retaliation now. If it needs to be anonymous, then so be it. What you have to say is so important to you that we're going to create multiple ways for you to participate, for you to share what you're seeing to help us be the best that we can be. So either you believe that as a leader or you don't. If you don't, the people will understand that and figure that out within 24 hours, maybe 24 minutes. But if you really believe it, it might take 24 days or 24 months to shift the people's perception that you truly believe it. But you must create the avenues for that participation and you stick with it and you stick with it. And if you're just doing this because it's what the textbook says to do, it'll never work. It really has to come from here. It has to be what you truly believe. That shows up in your values. And those values need to be something that leadership models and teaches and protects after they have defined it, so that the example that was mentioned before, so that we all understand what it truly means to be safe in this organization, so that we're not on different pages. And when you do that, then you create the kind of environment where people will feel safe and they'll express their opinions.
Sam, the fifth insight we have on this slide is ethics. And I want to emphasize this is not compliance. This is ethics. Where does ethics come in and how does Boeing begin to rebuild an ethical culture, not a culture of compliance, but an ethical culture?
I asked the CEO of an organization one time, and they were a smaller organization. They weren't thousands upon thousands of people. But I said, do you have a chief ethics and compliance officer? And he looked at me like I had been drinking or something. He said, all of us. This was the culture that they had created, that if something's not right, we need to make it right. And there was no question about that. This was what they had created that went on in that organization. They were in the home construction business. And before they released a home to someone who'd bought the home, they had 8 people walking through the home looking for things that were wrong. Now, they had the concrete guy looking, they had the drywall person looking, they had the electrical person working. Now, the concrete guy wasn't just looking at the concrete guy, was looking at the drywall, was looking at the plumbing. The finished person was looking at I mean, everyone was looking and giving their feedback. I asked the CEO, I said, doesn't the homeowner go through the home when they take the home and give you a list of all the things that they find that's not right? And he looked at me and he said, that's not their responsibility. That's our responsibility. That's a way of believing. It's a way of believing. And so if you want an ethical culture, if you want ethics to be high, then you reward ethics and you don't reward people that are making decisions that are less than ethical. If someone makes a decision that's less than ethical, you allow them to go someplace where that behavior is acceptable. But ethics, like everything else, and we've had some great comments in here. Lindsay, I appreciate what you just said, because this ties into what we're just talking about right now. I agree on all of this. Starts with leaders and people. Ethics starts at the top. No one's going to be more ethical than the leader ahead of them. And it cascades down. And it's senior leadership's responsibility to make sure that it is cascading at every level. I'm going to go back to what we talked about earlier, Tom. What we're talking about here is very simple, but I'm not going to tell you that it's easy. It takes commitment. It takes consistency.
Sam, I'd like to say a few words about the process that I think Boeing or any company needs to go through. And there is a process you can follow. The regulators talk about this process. Business development people talk about the process. Compliance professionals talk about the process. And there's really a way to think through this and use the culture audit tool as a part of that process. And Sam's going to walk us through that after the next slide. But here's, for me, the money slide on the process. The culture assessment. How do you assess your culture? Are you going to do it through town halls? Are you going to do it through small groups? Are you going to use a tool that you can use at scale, such as the culture audit? But it all starts with an assessment of where you are, because you can't put together a strategy to fix, remediate, go forward unless you know where you are. And if Boeing doesn't do something to assess where they are, to have a starting point beyond what we see in the public domain right now, they are really, I think, missing the boat. And more importantly, I don't think they're setting themselves up for success. Number two, the strategy you put in place based upon your assessment. From your assessment, you're obviously going to get raw data, and you'll get data that you can determine. We say the last 5 points that we just went over. We're low on ethics. We're low on trust. We have middling on stress, whatever that numbers might show, but you craft a strategy based upon that assessment that you have received. The next step, of course, is to implement that strategy, whether you call that training, whether you call that communication, whether you call that the leadership saying not simply what they are going to do, but then actually doing it, as Sam has said several times, but you implement that strategy. But it doesn't stop there, because what you have to do next is monitor the results of the implementation of that strategy. Monitor. Culture audit is a great tool to monitor because it can be used literally on an ongoing basis because it's a software tool. You can use other strategies. You can interview people. You can have the town halls. You can have the meetings we've talked about, but you've got to monitor. Now, this is not an audit. This is not a deep dive yet. It's ongoing monitoring to see if the strategy you have implemented is working. And then finally, the data you receive from the monitoring, you use that to refine, continually improve, continuous improvement of your overall strategy. So you see, it's a continuous process, but it all starts with that assessment. It's data driven. It is putting together a strategy based upon that data. It is then implementing that strategy and monitoring and continuing to prove it. And Sam, I'm going to ask you to maybe explain how the culture audit fits into several of these steps.
Great. Before I do that, real quick, if you have had a business book in your business, in your company, if they said you should read this book on leadership, if you'd put that title in the chat, I would like to see some of the different books that have come down that leaderships at some level of the organization has said, you should read this book. This is what we're going to follow. This is what we're going to live. If there is a book, put it in the chat. If you can't remember the name of the book, put the word yes in the chat. I would just like to see how many of you have had some sort of book that leadership at some point or time or another has said is important that we follow, that we stick to. While you're doing that, here's the thing. Organizations move from one way of thinking to another. But see, here it comes through. I see yes. I see a link to a book. Yeah. So there's okay. Here they're coming through. All different kinds of books. Now here's what we see. It's like the book du jour. So this is the book we're going to look at now. And then this is the book that we're going to follow this year. And this is the book that we're going to implement now. And so what happens is rather than it being cumulative, we see a lot of organizations that this is the program for 2023. This is a program for 2024. This is a program for 2025. There needs to be one constant, probably needs to be more than one, but one constant is we continually measure our culture, we evaluate what's going on, we make the changes that are necessary, and we move forward. And that's what the culture audit does. Because if you don't assess and create a strategy, then monitor the implementation of that strategy, then you have no way to know whether you have no way to know whether you're making that improvement month over month, year over year. And so that's really what it comes down to, is committing to measuring, to assessing, to creating strategy, and then to monitoring what's going on so that you see what's happening. And then year over year, you can make these continuous improvements. Tom?
The culture audit brings the information you need in multiple areas in the process that you go through to improve your overall culture. It can be used as a cultural assessment. And Sam went through just a piece of the questionnaires that we detail on the culture audit. The strategy that you put in place. He also talked about the insights that you get and the recommendations that the culture audit puts forward. You have to implement that strategy through training, through communication, through outreach. But then the culture audit is a tool that can be used to monitor that strategy. And I can't emphasize enough the importance of this is not a one and done. This is not, we've assessed it, we put a strategy in place, go forth and conquer. This is an ongoing discussion. This is an ongoing dialogue. This is an ongoing evolution of your overall corporate culture. And that is why the monitoring component is so critical. Even the regulators would say, okay, you got to a strategy, you implemented it. Now, what did you do? What were the results of that implementation? Did you take the results and then utilize that to improve? You didn't have any areas that needed improvement. You weren't looking at it. You weren't getting data on it. And then finally, the improvement on a continuous basis going forward. It can be 3 months, 6 months, 9 months. It could be monthly. That's the beauty of having a software-based tool or a SaaS-based tool that you can use multiple times in totality, everything, or you can have a focus on one particular area. So Sam and I believe that the culture audit is an incredibly useful tool for a company literally the size of Boeing down to an S&L or bank or financial institution that may be going through this. And I know Sam has worked in those areas specifically. We see a way forward for Boeing. And Sam, I wanted to maybe end by asking you, you started off once again talking about mergers and acquisitions and the culture when two organizations come together. But in addition to M&A, how do you see the culture audit can be used in other areas?
Well, the reason that we have this available in 20 languages is so that literally everyone in an organization has the ability to speak up. And around the world, this tool can be used. And what this does when it's being used on an annual basis by, yes, it's great in M&A. Absolutely. But for a single organization, whether you have 50 people or 50,000 people, as a leader, you need to know what's going on in your organization. You need to be able to measure it. You need data. If we start making decisions that aren't based on real data, then we're going to make bad decisions. And if we don't have real data, we don't even know that a decision needs to be made at times. And so that's why we've set this up with a free consultation that you're going to be able to talk to people and help them understand what's going on with their culture, take a behind the scenes look at the culture audit. And I love that. Lindsay, yes, what gets measured gets managed. Another expression is it gets treasured. Exactly. There's a link on the screen. I also put the link is in the notes and use that link, set up a free consultation because we want to show you how the culture audit will help you. Our goal is to help organizations create a high performance workplace culture that is high in ethics, that's high in safety, that's high in accountability. And the only way to do that, Tom, from our standpoint, is you have to measure what's going on so you can create and implement the plan and create that culture that you want.
We had a couple of people ask if the slide deck would be available and the recording will be available. The answer to both is yes.
Yeah, there'll be a link that's sent out. It'll go out tomorrow, and on that page, you'll be able to watch the video at that point. And Tom, we'll just make a note. Let's put the slide deck on that page as a free download for everybody as well, so they have the ability to download and have that. We want this message shared with as many people as possible. And Tom, there's some other resources that I want to send out over the next couple of weeks. I want to send out our case study for the Boeing situation because it may be a great case study for people to use internally in the organization. And I want to make sure that they get your white paper on the DOJ's conversation around the importance of measuring culture. So we'll make sure over the next few weeks that those items are sent out as well.
I wanted to thank everyone who attended. We've got a few minutes left. I don't see any questions, but if you do have any questions, if you put it in the chat function, we'll get it answered. If not, we will give you back, it looks like, 8 minutes of your lunch hour.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone. Dawn, thank you. Sue, Lindsay, Joya, David, it's good to see you. Sergey, thanks for participating. Mohammed, Luis, Andrew, we appreciate all the comments. Sharon earlier, David, thank you all. It's really been great to have this conversation and get your input, and we can move the needle. And I look forward to future conversations. Be sure and share the link when you receive it because others can benefit as well.
Looks like
And we'll end it right here.
okay.